Namaste and welcome to the realm of Damru and our series of talks as a part of our ongoing yoga festival, Bilva. Every year, we invite experts and scholars from indigenous wellness traditions in our Bilva Utsav. This year, adhering to the and adapting to the current situation, we reach out to you all through this online platform. The theme of Bilva Festival this year is Bharatiya Parampara, rebuilding modern India on the strong foundations of Sanatana Dharma. Today, we will interact with a person who is an expert on yoga, Vedic chanting, and so much more. I welcome Ms. Nritya Jagannathan to the Bilva Festival. She will be talking on the yoga of sound, exploring the use of sound in yogic practices. So many times people think yoga and sound are two separate tools for therapy or spiritual growth. Well, they can be, but combining both becomes a very powerful practice, not just for well being and therapy, but also for our spiritual growth. Many yoga teachers approach me and to clear out this dilemma on this subject. So today, let us see and learn about these integrative practices of yoga and sound, its importance and application. I feel very, very privileged to share that Ms. Nritya Jagannathan is my mentor and a dear friend. She is a senior yoga therapist from Krishnamacharya tradition. With over 18 years of teaching experience, she is currently the director of KYM Institute of Yoga Studies, Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram, Chennai, India. This is the training and certification wing of Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram. She has traveled extensively around the world to teach yoga and Vedic chanting and is a certified therapist from the International Association of Yoga Therapy, CIAYT. A classical Bharatanatyam dancer as well, Nritya is passionate about Indian culture and yoga philosophy. She is also the editor-in-chief of Darshanam, the quarterly journal of yoga and yoga chikitsa of Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram. And let me tell you that this is a very brief introduction to an extremely scholarly, multifaceted, and an humble persona that she carries. If I get into her awards, honors, and the range of topics that she teaches, I think I can just go on and on for a long while. But all I would say is that she is deeply rooted in the parampara of her guru, and her teachings are an embodiment of the life that she actually lives. The beautiful, inspiring human being that she is. I completely admire her and wish her the best for the humongous and such an important work that she is doing as a contribution to the Bharatiya Parampara. I am happy to welcome you, Nrityaji, again this year to the realm of Damru. It's truly a privilege to have you here. Welcome.
Namaste, and thank you, Mauli, for that very flowery introduction, I must say. I don't know if I'm deserving of this, but anyway, I'm here as an instrument to spread the teachings of our teachers, Sri Krishnamacharya and Sri TKV Desikachar, who founded the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram. Again, very happy to be back at Bilva in an online format this year, and hopefully next year we meet again in person. The yoga of sound, exploring the use of sound in yoga practices. See, people, when we speak of yoga, the most common image that comes to mind is that of asana, fundamentally asana. And now there is a little more of awareness about pranayama as well. But many people think of sound as a separate realm, especially the use of mantra. Naturally so, and also because of these added apprehensions of, whether using a mantra makes a practice of yoga specifically religious, and all these other questions. And the reason for this presentation is to establish that the entire parampara, the Guru Parampara, the Sishya Parampara, and the Parampara of teachings that we have in Bharata is entirely based on an oral tradition. All of these find their way back to the Vedic tradition. And this is something that should be celebrated and applied wherever possible. And yoga also is a domain where it lends itself to so much use. Within the tools of yoga that we have, ample ways in which sound can be used, if necessary, in a secular manner that is appropriate for people of any faith, any belief, any religion. And for those who are immersed in this Sanskriti, we can connect using objects and sounds that are relevant to every one of us. See, at the very apex of all creation, this is what our Upanishads also tell us, the Parabrahman, the Supreme, ever in a state of expansion. We understand it as being nirguna, beyond the realm of name, form, time, space. And yet this Brahman pervades every one of its creations. It is there everywhere in this universe. And we have many literary texts that tell us how the Supreme Brahman manifests and how does it create the world. The Spandakarika speaks of how at the foundation of creation is a very subtle throb, spanda. And this vibration, this throb, a primal throb, sets in motion creation. And the consolidation of this very subtle, intangible vibration is what emerges as the Shabda Brahman, which we celebrate as Om. Om iti Brahma, says the Taittiriya Upanishad. Every Upanishad, you take the Mundaka Upanishad, you take the Mandukya Upanishad, all of them extol Omkara as the source of everything. The Chandogya Upanishad, the very first shloka, the first mantra of the Chandogya Upanishad itself is an ode to Omkara as the supreme, and how Om is the very essence of everything. And this is how the universe as we know it evolved out of a vibration. Our literature, when you look at the Taittiriya Upanishad, speaks of the Brahman as supreme. Out of the Brahman evolved the 5 elements. You have space, Akasha, wind, Vayu, fire, Agni, water, Apa, and earth, Prithvi. These are the gross forms of the element. Underlying the gross forms are what we call Tanmatra, its essence. You could say that these are the subtle aspects of the 5 elements. And so you have Shabda Tanmatra, the ability to be heard, exclusive to Akasha, which transmits space, wind, which can be sensed using the skin, fire, which is the first of the element that has form, Rupa Tanmatra. This develops into water, which has Rasa Tanmatra, the ability to be tasted. And lastly, the last evolute is earth with Gandha Tanmatra, the sense of the ability to be smelt. And so we could say that if we go further into this model, that all the elements that evolve subsequently after Akasha are in some form or some way just a combination or a permutation of different Shabda Tanmatras. We have many perspectives from the Sankhya Karika, from the Panchikaranam idea of Vedanta. I'm looking primarily at Sankhya Karika, which says, this is the Tattva Kaumudi commentary, which says that the Akasha Mahabhuta emerges out of Shabda. And then thereafter, it is only a progressive multiplication of Shabda, which means that Shabda produces Akasha, Shabda Tanmatra along with the Tanmatra of Sparsha produces Vayu, Shabda Tanmatra plus Sparsha plus Rupa gives rise to Agni, Shabda, Sparsha, Rupa and Rasa give rise to Apa, Shabda, Sparsha, Rupa, Rasa, Gandha together give rise to Prithvi. But the common factor in all these elements is Shabda Tanmatra, and that becomes the building block of our known tangible universe. I would like to validate the use of sound before I go into the actual application, because the use of sound is not just a new construct. It's not something that's been here just recently or created only by Krishnamacharya or Desikachar. The use of sound has been there since time immemorial. And one of our most valuable resources, references, is the Yoga Sutra. For those of us who practice yoga, the Yoga Sutra is the text that we refer to. And in presenting Ishvara Pranidhana in chapter 1, Patanjali tells us that it is imperative that one connects at a deep level and surrenders to Ishvara. Here, remember, Ishvara is the supreme, the source of this universe. Not specifically, Patanjali does not speak about any particular form of the divine here. He speaks about the principle, that is the master of this universe. This connection to Ishvara can happen through pranava, tasya vachakaha pranavaha. There is some utterance, and that utterance, you need something to denote this being. See, why is this specified? Why does this supreme have to be connected to through sound? See, when you take the case of any term, many terms in our language, any language, are agreed upon by social convention. See, for instance, you take an animal, and we say this has two hoofs, two horns, four legs, a large body. It has udders, it has a small hump, and we say this is a bovine animal, bovine mammal, and we say this is called a cow. Now, this word cow in English language, or buffalo, is of convention, social convention, born of a process of discussion. Quite easily, we could have called it camel as well, if that was the discussion. As long as we're very clear that this word connotes this object, there's no problem if you're switching it. It has to be socially accepted by everyone who's using that language. But when you're dealing with a subject like Ishvara, at an individual level, if I asked you to say, define God, I'm sure every one of us will come up with so many words describing the attributes of this God. But there has to be one common substratum that binds all these forms, all these names, and that is Omkara. Tasya vachakaha pranavaha, tat japaha. How do you say this? You have to do a japa, you have to do a mindful recitation. And when it is done, naturally, the power of that vibration itself creates a shield of protection. And so we see that Omkara represents the tangible form, what we call the Shabda Brahman form of the intangible supreme, that which cannot be seen, that which is unmanifest, which is the Parabrahman. As I said, the Taittiriya Upanishad speaks of this. Om iti Brahma, Om iti evedam sarvam. Everything in this universe is Omkara. The Narayana Upanishad, also known as the Atharva Shira Upanishad, says, Pratyaganandam Brahma Purusham Pranavaswarupam. This Brahma Purusham, which is eternally in a state of Ananda, what is its form? Pranavaswarupam. What is the form of the Pranava? Akara, Ukara, Makara iti, and so on. The text goes. The Mundaka Upanishad also validates. A very beautiful, very popular verse of the Mundaka Upanishad says that we exist as humans. This birth is given to us only for the purpose of realization of Brahman. Everything else is secondary. But how? How does one realize the magnificence of this Brahman? Through a pathway of meditation. And here, very beautifully, Pranavo hi danuhu, sharo hi atma, Brahma tat lakshanam uchyate. Tat lakshanam, the goal that we have to hit with the arrow is Brahman. How do you do it? Pranava, Omkara is the bow. Sharo hi atma, the self, is the arrow. And using this, we take aim and you let the arrow fly. But what is required? Apramattena vedavyam, without any distraction. And then Sharavat Tanmayo Bhavet, because then you become, this arrow reaches its target and merges with it. And so again we see Omkara presented as one of the fundamental principles of Dhyana, of Japa. Shabda Brahmani Nishnataha Parabrahman Adhigacchati. A very beautiful idea that we see in a number of texts. What it says is that we don't know, we can't, the Supreme, the Parabrahman is intangible, not comprehensible to our ordinary senses, and definitely not comprehensible by the mind, which is much grosser. But then how does this mind learn to connect? It connects, it follows the sound. Shabda Brahmani Nishnata, it follows, holds on to the sound, here the Omkara, and that leads it to the highest. And this process is through little by little directing and then learning to still the mind. But if you have to meditate in silence, you have to move from the world of sound into the subtle realms where sound and speech gives way to the highest level, which is silence. See, our goal as humans, the gift of being born human, is to realize the Supreme, to realize our nature as divine. But to do this, one needs the mind. Now, the mind in it of itself is not capable of realizing the magnificence of Brahman. It needs a tool, it needs a medium. And Shabda Brahman, Omkara, becomes this means. By holding on to the Omkara, it is possible to take the mind to higher levels of realization. But to meditate in silence, to move to the realm of silence, is not easy. It can be very daunting, it can be overwhelming. To move from the world of sound, from the world of name and form, to the subtler inner realms as sound gives way to silence. This is seen in the 4 stages of speech that are presented in our tradition. You have Para, Pashyanti, Madhyama, and Vaikhari. Para representing Brahman, the Supreme, which is manifested as Nada Brahman or Omkara or Shabda Brahman. And this idea of the spoken word is very powerful, very potent, because it is a manifestation of our thoughts and intentions. It is this one of the reasons why sound becomes such a potent practice. There is another very beautiful idea in the Dhyana Bindu Upanishad, which is mirrored in a number of other texts, about the very act of breathing itself being what we call Ajapa Dhyanam, a silent inner resonance. As the air flows in, as the prana flows in through the inhalation, the sound Saha is supposed to be produced. And as we exhale, the sound Hum. And this constant reiteration of Saha, Hum becomes Aham, Saha or Soham, which becomes a very important model of meditation. This is known as Ajapa Dhyanam. Japa is to do a conscious meditation use with your volition. Ajapa, it happens on its own, organically, all the time. And this dhyanam on this inner resonance is highly recommended in various practices of the Hatha as well as the Tantric traditions. This is a natural inner resonance. And so we are not separate from sound in any way. We are always connected to this idea of Shabda, to the idea of vibration. In fact, the entire universe is, in essence, a humongous compilation of vibrating particles, vibrating atoms, vibrating subatomic particles. And this is the field that quantum science is also exploring, that at a fundamental level, everything is vibrating, everything is in movement. Krishnamacharya highlights this again in the Yoga Rahasya. He calls attention to the Manusmriti, speaking with great reverence to the technique known as Sagarbha Pranayama or Samantraka Pranayama. And this is one of the, it's interesting that the Manusmriti actually mentions this and says that Nadi Shuddhi Pranayama has to be done with the mental recitation of the Gayatri Mantra. This is a very important technique considered among the highest techniques of pranayama, because as the breath goes in and out, in the mind, the mantra is constantly playing itself out. Now here we see that there are ample references. I've just given you a handful here because of time, but everywhere you look at the Prashna Upanishad, Mandakya Upanishad, Chandogya Upanishad, all these texts, the Shvetasvatara Upanishad, every text tells us about the power of the Omkara and the use of sound. So enough we have to validate why use sound as a tool within the framework of yoga. In fact, another important validation is Swadhyaya, the concept of Swadhyaya presented as the second component of Kriya Yoga. And so the use of sound in a yoga practice is not alien, is not something that's artificially created. It's inherent in our tradition. But naturally, there are questions, especially when yoga at this time reaches people from everywhere. Naturally, there are questions. Won't this be a religious imposition, or my religion, my faith prevents me from chanting certain sounds and so on, or this makes me feel uncomfortable, which is perfectly okay, acceptable. What was beautiful was that Krishnamacharya was a staunch bhakta, unswerving in his devotion. But when it came to his students, he was very liberal. And he said, you have to find your object or your deity to which you connect. In fact, in the book Health, Healing and Beyond, he says, Narayana is my Ishvara. You have to find yours in your tradition. And so in the KYM, chanting, Vedic chanting or any chanting, we have never thrust it upon hesitant or unwilling students, because people come from different backgrounds. But we have used the core principle of sound and how we apply it, always keeping in mind the student's preference, the student's comfort. Sir Desikachar has taught so many practices. In fact, I would say nearly 60 to 80% of our course plans for yoga therapy involve sound in some form or the other. And he took a lot of care to design practices with a variety of sounds. We have used Ma, we've used Shalom for those of the Hebrew tradition, Amen, Allahu Akbar, Shantihi. Also, Senor Jesus, very beautifully, he put this into the chanting meter and say, Senor Jesus, as you raise your arms, and then Senor Jesus, as you lower the arms. Om Namo Narayanaya, Om Ram Ramaya Namaha. So many possibilities. And so there is no imposition, there is no forcing, and you can explore. There's so much to explore in terms of what chanting does when we apply the tools of yoga. Now, just a few minutes, let's take a simple practice. This is just for us to understand what is the use of sound at a fundamental level. Now, try to breathe in and out slowly without any control of the breath. Just breathe in to whatever your capacity is. Breathe out as deeply, as slowly as you can. Just a few breaths and watch of how long it takes for you to inhale and how long it takes for you to exhale. I'll give you a minute. Now, inhale deeply, and as you exhale, chant Ma. Chant for as long as you can. Exhale as you chant. There is no need to hold your breath. Do this a few times. Breathe in, and as you chant Ma, breathe out. You must have noticed, this is something that many people do notice, some kind of a lengthening, at least of your exhalation when you chant. This itself, it might even be by a few seconds, but many people, when you sit and you practice, notice a considerable lengthening, up to sometimes even twice as much as you could do before. This is one of the greatest gifts of sound, that it is a very, very useful practice to lengthen the exhale. And it's very important to work on lengthening the exhale. And we have so much of research evidence that tells us what happens to the parasympathetic nervous system as we increase the length of inhale and exhale. So now let us go further into how sound is used in practices. See, the tools of yoga are many, and the sounds can be integrated, whether it's asana, pranayama, dhyanam, so many ways you can integrate sound. At a physiological level, any sound, any chant, usually we say start with a simple open mouthed sound, something that starts and moves like ma or ha ra. So just a one syllable, usually open sound, naturally lengthens exhalation. What happens over a period of time as you work on lengthening the exhale, it will contribute to an improved quality and length of the inhale function. So just by the simple addition of breathing in, you can't chant aloud when you breathe in naturally. So you inhale as you normally do. And when you chant, you breathe out. This itself at a physiological level contributes to much better exhalation. When exhalation improves, this will contribute to the inhale capacity. And using this, one could also work on retention. Now, what happens is, see, what is the purpose of exhalation? Inhalation is invigorating. It brings energy, it nourishes, you could say it gives you strength, all of this. Exhalation, the nature of exhalation is to eliminate what is not needed. In yogic terms, inhale is a prana function, exhale is an apana function. And apana, what does it do? It focuses on throwing out from the system what your system does not require. Naturally, when you chant on the exhale and you lengthen the duration of the exhale, you are placing an increased focus on the elimination. So little by little, we see that the gradual lengthening of an exhale. Remember, this is always done within an individual's capacity. There's no pressure anyway to extend beyond capacity. But this, using a chant to lengthen exhale, is a very safe and very, very certain way of helping a person extend their breath. In fact, for many people who are new to yoga, we receive a number of care seekers who are sometimes much older, who've not done much yoga before. And for them to coordinate breath and movement is sometimes very complex. But the use of a chant, when you say, as you breathe in, you do this movement, and then you chant and you do this movement, makes it a little more easy. We see that when you use the chanting on the exhale, there is a complete, much deeper elimination of toxins, of impurities from all over the system. And as an outcome, almost all our care seekers, after a few days or even a week or so of practice, say that they feel much lighter. This may not be a reduction in terms of weight, but there is a sense of lightness because the apana function is well strengthened. See, coming to a cognitive level, instantly, the moment you use a chant, your ability to concentrate, to pay attention increases. See, with an asana, there are movements that are done. But after a point, when you know the postures really well, it's very easy for your mind to wander. You can think of something else. Your arms are moving, your body is moving, you're doing all the sequences. But in your mind, you're thinking about what should I make for dinner? When will the children come? Should I do this? Should I do that? So many thoughts. Now, one way of eliminating these unnecessary thoughts in a practice and bringing attention, chanting is very, very powerful. And there was a study conducted in Chennai by one of my teachers, Dr. Lata Satish, where a group of children were given a set of random words. There were two groups. And so one group was given a set of random English words, chosen completely at random. Another group was given the Saraswati mantra, Prano Devi Saraswati Vajebir Vajinivati Dhinama Vitri Avatu. This is the mantra. And both were required to go through their words or go through the mantra every day for a certain period. And so naturally, they were the pre and post assessment, all of the necessary research questionnaires were administered. And what the results of this study revealed was that after the same period, post the training and the data that comes through, the second group that was doing the Saraswati mantra demonstrated considerable improvement of cognitive functioning processing speed, and emotional maturity. This was published as a study. And what they also found was that attention was intense and attention span for these children was longer. Levels of mental distraction came down. And they also repeated the same study a few months after the completion of the research program. And they realized that after 3 months, because of what had been done before, these children from the second group also had better retention capacities. Their ability to remember certain things that were taught to them was much more than the other group. So there's ample research, ample evidence that shows us that the use of chants, specifically for those who are so inclined, the use of mantras, Vedic mantras, smritis, shlokas, because all of these are in Sanskrita, and the bhasha, the language itself is very potent in terms of its structure. And so there's a natural increase, enhancing of the cognitive, intellectual capabilities. From an emotional perspective, you see that again here I'm speaking of Sanskrita, but this applies to any words that are powerful or that are said with a positive, affirmative thought, good words. This is very important when we speak, not to speak negatively, because when you speak, when it's uttered aloud, it can manifest. And the speech is only an outcome of our intention, which is why our elders in this tradition, in the Sanatana Dharma tradition, it's very important to only speak good things, to speak well, to speak good things, to speak kindly, to speak politely. These are very important. We don't, if there are people who are older at home and if you use bad language or use something that is negative, immediately one would be reprimanded and said, don't say things like that. You're not separate. See, just as Omkara is the substratum for Ishvara, Omkara represents Brahman, Omkara represents Ishvara. Just as where you take the lamp, if there's a flame of the lamp, naturally there is light. In the same way, every word is filled, it's just pervaded with artha. And when you connect to when you have a bhavana of the inherent artha, literally what this does is that whether you know the meaning of the chant, whether you don't know it, if the chant is done properly, naturally it will impact us positively, because we are constantly reiterating something that is positive, that is enabling, that is empowering and affirmative. If one is not comfortable with the use of Sanskrita sounds, you can use other sounds from any language, from any tradition. And this is something that one of my students reported, a student of chanting, for a very long time. After 2 years of chanting or so, she said that she experienced much lower irritability. And in fact, she gave me an example, and she said that before, when I was on the road driving my two-wheeler, and we know how people drive in India. And so every time someone flouted the rules or someone cut across my path, I would be so angry. I would try to go behind that person and I would yell, I would lose my temper. And she said something has changed now after these 2 years of chanting. I find that this is not affecting me anymore. I'm able to let go and say that this is that person's choice to behave in this way. I'm not going to let it affect me. And she was able to make the connection between her practice of chanting and the change in her emotional irritability and reactivity. She said that I'm able to so many things in my life, I'm just able to just let it go without having to react to everything. This is a very important emotional outcome when we use chanting. At a psychological level, especially when we are dealing with people who suffer from stress, from anxiety, from depression, and these thoughts can be overwhelming. They can lead us to really, really dark, sad spaces where there's great grief, great trauma. The use of sound integrated into the yoga practice can be a very powerful technique of diversion, where instead of feeding a particular cycle of negative thoughts or feelings, instead we give them a sound to connect, something that is special to that person. Remember, as I said, we don't impose a sound. The sound is always chosen with the complete consent of the student. So when they learn to connect to a sound that for them holds some value, there is a different samskara, a new thought, a new feeling, at least for the period that they are doing that sound or chanting. And this can, if you try to build this up, every time that feeling of negativity or being pulled down comes, if we can get them to remember what it felt to chant. So the chanting can be used to change the samskara. Sir would say, Prabalena durbalasya badaha. There are always going to be negative samskaras that will focus on, pulling you down, sucking your energy out. We shouldn't feed them. And neither should we worry about them. They are there. We have to accept them. Create a new set of samskaras, new positive samskaras that are so strong, so powerful, so affirmative, that because they are so strong, the other samskaras are hidden and they just gradually leave the system. Naturally, see, these are things that take time. This will not happen overnight. This is a long process, but it can happen. Spiritually, again, for those who are so inclined, see, when you see the word mantra, mananat trayate iti mantra, when you recite it, it will protect. And so at a spiritual level, these mantras are very powerful anchors because they keep us focused on the path of apavarga. See, bhoga is the path that we are all in, engaging with the material world, constantly this cycle of, I want this, I want that, I need to earn more money, I need a bigger house, I need a bigger car. This is one path that, unfortunately, our modern mainstream education is also enabling, and it says that this is what you need to be validated, or this is your purpose to have achieved this. But the Sanatana Dharma says bhoga is okay, but in a limited sense. Your purpose is apavarga. You need to move to a space of stillness, and mantra can be a very potent way of doing this because it offers a spiritual shield that prevents us from being distracted. And naturally, these vibrations they're spreading everywhere. And so as the mantra affects you, it affects your system. Every one of the panchamayas can be influenced by the chanting of the mantra, and the vibrations also spread. Because remember, shabda is just a wave, just it behaves, sound is a wave. And once it is uttered, it keeps traveling endlessly in time, endlessly in space. You cannot hear it because we are limited. Our range of hearing is extremely limited. But the vibration of that mantra will continue. Again, at an environmental level, as I said, if we subscribe to this idea of Shabda Tanmatra being the building block, naturally, since every other element is n number of multiplications of Shabda Tanmatra, through the sound, it is possible to bring about an environmental impact and therefore affect all the creatures in it. Especially in these times, increasingly the last 4 months have taught us the need to go back to our roots. So many ideas about achara, the right way of behaving, of niyama, disciplines that we have to follow, and of course the need for masking. And the Sanatana Dharma tradition says that the mantra mask is the highest, the most powerful, because nothing can penetrate it. Because the power of the mantra is subtler than everything that we see. And mantra can penetrate any body. It can penetrate any physical obstacle of any kind. It can go beyond. And so our tradition, the Shruti and Smriti traditions, give us a huge array of chants. You can choose any number of chants to replace the chain of negative thoughts, because this is where we are. In fact, I saw this very beautiful video made by someone now with the COVID-19 situation, where he says that on the one hand, yes, there is this fear of falling ill, but bigger than this is the fear created by media, the negativity, the sheer volume of negative information that is thrown at us, whether you want to see it or not. You turn the TV on, you're only looking at death rates. You turn your Facebook feed on, that's all that you're seeing. Everywhere, you're constantly being inundated with messages of negativity, messages of that are, their orientation itself is to make you feel afraid. And this is no way to live our life. Mantras become very affirmative ways of changing this negativity. So many stories we have. The story of Valmiki and Vashishta, where in this conflict between Valmiki and Vashishta, Vashishta says something very beautiful when Valmiki says, where are you getting this power? Because Vashishta is able to deploy the power of his penance. And Vashishta says, Digbalam, Kshatriya Balam, Brahma Tejo Balam Balam. You have Balam, the Tejas, the power of the Brahman, which is the power of meditation, which is the power of Adhyayanam, that is the highest. And that is when Kaushika realizes the power of penance, of meditation, and then he goes on a path, and he takes on a path that eventually leads him to becoming a Brahmarishi. This is Vishwamitra and Vashishta. The story of Valmiki, how an ordinary robber, someone who basically confronts travelers in the forest, loots them, kills them if needed, to earn a living for his family, how he is given a sound, and his mind is so very oriented to crime and to hurting others that even the word Rama he is not able to pronounce, and so the rishis give him Mara instead. See, Mara in some traditions you can say also has to do with death, Marana, and he says, you repeat it, it's okay. But as he chants Mara, 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 it becomes Rama, Rama, Rama. The power of that mantra itself leads to his transformation. So the stories are abundant how chanting can help us replace negative samskaras with affirmative ones. Remember that name and form is immaterial, intent is what matters. And so we have an inexhaustible source of energy because this is the energy of the Brahman. Om iti Brahma. Om is the sound that denotes this Brahman. And this is a source that's never going to deplete. And so at a time when there is so much uncertainty, so much fear, one can weave literally potent masks of protection around us. And it doesn't matter if you don't know the meaning, the intention, the connection to these sounds is what is important. Because at the heart of the mantra's power is the very, very beautiful, very strong, positive, affirmative intentions that are held there. This is another extensive study on the effect of sound, which comes from a researcher in Japan, Masaru Emoto. I think many of us would have read his book, The Secret Life of Water, where he photographs water crystals and he tries to demonstrate how the exposure to different kind of sounds, and not just sounds, intentions, changes very, very dramatically the shapes of the water crystals that are formed. And so these are very interesting ideas that when the crystals that form when they are exposed to good words, to positive words in any language, the language doesn't matter, but the intention behind the word. So when there is an exposure to positive sounds, positive words, they form such beautiful crystals. Whereas when the crystals, the water is exposed to negative words, to words of hatred, to things that are negative, the crystals that form are very, very distorted, very ugly. And so this again is a validation of the idea that Shabda Tanmatra underpins all matter. And so when you learn to use sound effectively, naturally you can impact matter. Mind is also a part of matter. You can impact the body, you can impact the breath using this. At another level, you could also say that sound connects to yajna. It's also a form of yajna. And the Bhagavad Gita tells us that, in fact, our entire cycle, the water cycle, if we have to survive, we need plants, we need fertile lands. What causes fertility? The timely advent of rain. What causes rain? Rain clouds have to aggregate. And what is the cause of this aggregation of rain clouds? Karma, yajna. What are these yajnas? The various offerings that we do. It could be the ritual Agnihotra, the fire sacrifices, or the other of the Pancha Yajna, the practice of Brahma Yajna, which is chanting. Pitra Yajna, the offerings that are made to our ancestors. Bhuta Yajna, to all creatures. Manushya Yajna, everything that is done in service of others. All of these come together, creating a certain very, very potent vibration. And this vibration is able to alter the composition of the atmosphere, causing the aggregation of clouds which bring rain. And so at multiple levels, you see that sound as a tool is extremely potent. It can impact us at many dimensions. The use of sound in asana, so again, each of these is the subject of a very, very lengthy discussion, because a lot can be said about how sound is used. And naturally, this requires some amount of training. This doesn't just happen. One needs to train. One has to have a foundation in, first of all, asana technique, Then training in how asana, the breath integrated movements, course planning is needed. So what I'm saying here is not something that can be randomly administered. There is some amount of, there's a process in creating these course plans. But in our tradition, we use sound to intensify the effect of a posture. Specifically, so you could, how do we do this? You could use sound in the stay. You could do any posture and stay in that posture. And for a certain period of time, you can chant. The Surya Namaskara done with the Surya Mantra is a classic example. Traditionally, this was how it was done. In fact, the Surya Namaskara practice was considered to go hand in hand with the recitation of the Aruna Prashna. And so after the end of every Anuvaka, the students would be asked to do one cycle of the Surya Namaskara, which is an asana sequence, along with the Surya mantras. Om Ram Udyan Adya Mitra Maha, Om Mitra Yanamaha, and so on, which we find in the Vedic tradition. So there is an intensification that happens at a physical level and naturally in terms of attention required. In fact, I remember in one of my early lessons with Shri Deskachar, he had a group of us whom he was teaching, and he'd actually make us do postures like a Bhujangasana, which is a prone back arch. By itself compromises your breathing, and we'd have to stay in Bhujangasana and chant the Surya Mantra. And he said that these are ways to enhance your attention, at the same time build up the stamina. Now, this, can I use it for everyone? No. For children, it's much easier because children are much more pliable, supple, and to stay like this for a long time will not harm them. But for adults, has to be used with caution. Sound, as I said, can be used to lengthen the breath. So naturally, see, for instance, when you're doing an Uttanasana and you inhale and you raise your arms, exhale and you go down, it would take a certain time. Now, if you were to use the chant, naturally, when your exhale lengthens, the time taken to move into the forward bend also becomes more. And so the quality of your practice changes. How do we use the sound in asana? We can use it loudly on the exhalation, because you cannot chant aloud on the inhale. You can chant aloud even holding your breath after the exhalation. But usually we chant mentally in the mind on inhale and hold after inhale. This is the normal approach. And one could decide, depending on the capacity of the student, what kind of chant do I use? How much of chant do I use? Depends on the capacity of the student. And sometimes we use sound in asana along with visualization. So specifically in therapy or in any other context, this is very useful. We had one student with some issues with chest opening primarily, and some respiratory issues, asthma related issues, a certain tightness in the region of the chest. And so we had a course. See, typically in our approach in the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram, what we do is we do a very detailed analysis of the students' needs, looking at a Panchamaya perspective. What is the symptom manifesting at the Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, Anandamaya? And after a very thorough assessment, we design practices that are appropriate for that individual. Now, for this student, the focus was a practice that had a lot of back arches, opening the hands this way, opening the hands this way. So, say a Virabhadrasana, a modified Virabhadrasana with the support of the wall, and the student had to open. Now, here the teacher added Yam Vayave Namaha. So, inhale. And then in the posture, chant and exhale. Yam Vayave Namaha. Inhale. And then again, draw the hands to the chest. This was just one adaptation in Virabhadrasana, the warrior posture. And here we see that Yam is Vayu Bija, the sound of wind. Vayave Namaha, I salute the wind. So we see that the movements themselves are beneficial. No doubt there is a chest opening, but the inclusion of the chant also brings in the mind, brings in that much more attention. And so we see that at subtler levels, at subtler psychological and physiological dimensions, the use of the chant along with the asana contributes further. Again, remember, as I said, this is not imposed. If someone is not comfortable, we will not impose the chant, but the effect of yoga is multiplied several fold when we use select chants. If a person doesn't want to use something that is specifically in a tradition, in our tradition like this, we could also use ma in the movement, inhale, and then ma can be used, om can be used, or can be replaced with any of the other words that I discussed before. In pranayama, Sagarbha pranayama is considered, as I said, the one of the best forms of pranayama. But at a preliminary level, you can use the sound to build up the ability of the mind to focus. Because in the scheme of the Ashtanga Yoga, pranayama is essential to prepare the mind for dhyana, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. And so the use of sound, very easy way of getting people to focus. You tell someone, okay, breathe in, focus on your inhale, focus on your exhale. Very easy to get diverted. When you say, okay, inhale, chant ma. Now, as you inhale, try to chant ma in your mind, and then you chant ma as you exhale. Naturally, you're bringing their mind's attention to that moment, to the sound. And so the chances of wandering are much more minimized. Nadi Shuddhi Pranayama with Gayatri Mantra mentally is very highly recommended in practices of dhyana and can be used in many other contexts. We can use pranayama like Shitali, Sitkari. We can use chanting. Again, can be done loudly, softly, or mentally. Usually, the loud chanting is done only on exhale and hold after exhale. Otherwise, we chant mentally. And in fact, they say that some people who have studied the alphabet and also the structure of the meters and mantras say that even those, the very structure, say you take the Gayatri Mantra, Om Bhur Bhuvassuvaha Tatsaviturvarenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yona Prachodayat. So you have very neat divisions here of the Gayatri into lines that have 24 syllables. You see that within this, as you chant, one has to breathe in between. You inhale and you chant. So this process of chanting itself, because of the structure of the chants and the pauses that we give, in itself is a form of breath regulation. And this is another form of pranayama. In dhyana, we use sound as the link, because dhyana is the idea of what is dhyana? Yoga chitta vritti nirodha, the ability to direct the mind exclusively in the direction of a chosen object and to sustain this without distraction for a certain period of time. And when we look at the commentaries, the word yoga is equated with both dhyana and with samadhi, meditation and absorption. Krishnamacharya clarifies, he says dhyana is the cause, samadhi is the effect. But now we need some way. If you just tell your mind, okay, now close your eyes and then you think of this object, it's very hard to do. There will be 100 distractions, 1,000 distractions. Where you use sound, we are again cutting out all the possible distractions. So chanting is used in the nyasas that we use as the build-up to dhyanam. We use chanting in the pranayama, chanting in the asana, because it helps to bring the mind to attention. And it's a very simple way of creating a connection to the object. And we can use different chants for different objects of meditation. See, from the perspective of rehabilitation, this is again feedback from our work. Our teachers who work with children who have special needs and children and adults with differing abilities, we run a clinic every Sunday. And there are children who come from everywhere. And also this is feedback from the various center coordinators where KYM has been collaborating. All of them, these teachers and the center heads, what they have reported to us is that when we use these sounds in teaching children with special needs, there are certain key areas where there is an improvement. One is articulation. Their ability to articulate words clearly becomes much better. Stammering comes down, because naturally the process of chanting gives you control over the use of the speaking apparatus. So the stammering comes down. Drooling in children with certain special needs, the frequency or the intensity of drooling comes down. An important change happens at an emotional level where aggression comes down and staying ability is more. They're able to stay in a certain place for a certain period of time, little longer than they were able to do. and their ability to follow instructions, to listen, to pay attention, and to do what has been told to them has increased. And so all of these are based on feedback. We haven't really done a study per se, but this is based on individual feedback from the parents, from the teachers, and from various collaborating centers who have seen that the integration of chanting and practices of yoga has contributed very beneficially. But this, of course, requires much more structured research. Here, we can also see sound is not, again, you don't just choose sounds randomly. There are many ways where you can use a sound to create a certain effect. This is the effect that we want for a practice. So, for instance, when I want to invigorate, when I want to push up the energy levels, someone who's feeling, very low, very lethargic, not much energy. Again, remember, this is highly individualized. I cannot tell you with any certainty that use only this sound for this effect. It depends on whom you are using it for, and that choice has to be done very, very carefully because people can be very sensitive. But generally, sounds like Hram, Hreem, these are considered high energy sounds. These are the sounds of the bija of the sun. So you have Om Hram, Om Hreem, Om Hroom, Om Hraim, Om Hraum, Om Hraham. We can use any combination of these sounds to create what we call a Brahmana effect, an energizing effect. Parallelly, you have sounds that are very calming. The nature, the sound itself is like that. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. The word Shanti itself means Shamanam, to be pacified. Naturally, because the meaning is inherent in the sound, there is a difference between hearing Om, Ram, and Shanti. The quality itself is different. So it brings in a relaxing effect. You have certain neutral sounds that balance, which typically when we say Namaha or Mitraya Namaha, and then we use many permutations and combinations depending on the object. Sounds related to the sun are considered energizing. Sounds related to the moon are considered calming, and so on. Also, while you can choose the chant itself to change the effect, you can also change the effect by varying the pitch and the volume. These are other ways of working with sound. So, for instance, Om Hram, Om Hreem is done at a certain pitch. Now, if I wanted to increase the Brahmana effect, Om Hram, Om Hreem, and so on can be done. And then you can combine, say, a Virabhadrasana. Typically, when you look at the back arch, a back arch is considered to be energizing. So you do a back arch and you do the Surya Mantra, you're trying to increase the overall effect of energization. But you can also club and say that you can have a forward bend where you want to have multiple effects. So you have a forward bend, say an Uttanasana, but you use Om Hra. So you're combining a Brahmana chant with a Langana movement, relaxing movement. Or sometimes, for instance, we can do a Shitali pranayam. Now, Shitali by its nature is Langana, it's calming, it's relaxing. But if I want to relax, at the same time, I want to keep a little bit of the energy or the attention higher, I can do inhale Shitali. Om Hram. And so on. Another way is to vary the volume. Generally, chants chanted at high volume are associated with invigoration, whereas when you lower the volume, there is a sense of calming. So the same thing you do, Om Ram, different effect. Om Ram, different effect. So there are a variety of ways. Here I'm just giving you an overview of the potential that exists. To actually apply them, one requires deeper study. Now, what are the traditional chants that can be used in a practice? We have the chants that are associated with the chakras. The lower chakras we know are associated with the 5 elements. So we have Lam, Earth, Vam. So the Earth chakra, Mooladhara, we have Lam, Lam Prithvyai Namaha. Any combination of this. Vam, Adbhyaha, Adbhyo Namaha, the water chakra, Swadhisthana. Ram, Agnaye Namaha, to do with Manipuraka. Yam, the center, Anahata. Ham, Akashaya Namaha. And then the higher chakras, there are many perspectives here. People use Om for the Agnya and silence for Sahasrara. This is one school of thought. Others use Om, and so on. We can use chants focusing on the 5 pranas. Pranaya Namaha, Apanaya Namaha, and so on. Then you can have chants that focus specifically on the sun, on the moon, depending on which quality. Mitraya Namaha, addressed to the morning sun. Ravaye Namaha, Bhaskaraya Namaha, that which illumines. Somaya Namaha, to the moon. Taraya Namaha, the stars. Nakshatraya Namaha, and so on. You have chants on the 5 elements. You have the Bija mantras again, Lam, Vam, Ram, Yam, Ham, and abundance of literature. The Vedic and Smriti texts give you so many chants about the 5 elements and their connection to the system. The Lagunyas are such a beautiful mantra that connects elements on the outside to the corresponding function of different organs in the body. So there are so many options. We can also work on chants that focus on peace. The Shanti mantras bring us peace. Gayatri mantra is essentially a mantra for clarity, for conviction. Mantras to control the senses, to facilitate love. Love, when I say love, I don't mean ordinary, material, sensual, sensory love, which is okay. But love at the highest level, love for the divine. And attitude of faith, you have the Shraddha Suktam. And we can pull out elements from these and create little chant units that can be applied in various contexts. We have various chants to honor the Guru Parampara. Gurave Namaha, Gurubhyo Namaha, Satgurubhyo Namaha, Vande Guru Paramparam. So many things that can come together naturally within the Indian tradition. All the Devata Namavalis, you have chants you can take from the Vishnu Sahasranama, Lalita Sahasranama. You have the various other Sahasranamas. You have the Ashtotra Namavalis. All of these are chants in honor of Ishta Devatas. So you choose what you are connected to. Shanmukhaya Namaha, Ganeshaya Namaha, Durgaye Namaha, Ambaye Namaha. Depending on your connection, whoever your Ishta Devata is, you can create a bridge of connection between you and the Ishta Devata through this process. Now, one thing here, before I'm coming to the end of my presentation, on another note, see, when we speak of the impact of chanting, and I spoke to you about exhalation, the exhale function becoming better. This is indirectly, you could also say directly connected to the function of the vagus nerve. And now there's again so much study on the polyvagal theory, the functions of the vagal nerve. Why is it important to stimulate the vagus response? Because the vagus nerve is associated with the parasympathetic nervous system. And so where we are in a situation of great stress, the sympathetic nervous system is activated. Now, traditionally, what would happen is that one confronted, when I say traditionally, I mean in olden days, you are confronted with a situation that is threatening. There is naturally that it's a fight or flight response, because our stressors were invariably in the form of animal attacks or some sudden calamity, earthquake, volcano. These are the things that, and so your body gears up, your mind gears up, adrenaline pumps, and you're ready to confront. You face the situation, you battle it, or you run away. This is what we were conditioned. Our bodies are programmed. Now, what is happening is that our stressors are no longer these physical, tangible objects. All our stressors are sitting here in our mind. And often these stressors, they create a surge of the stress hormones, but there's no way to channelize them because the response is no longer a fight-flight response. And so what is happening is that there is an excessive production of the stress hormones, no way to channelize them out. And so in a sense, because of the triggering of the amygdala, all the time the mind is alert, ready to fight, ready to enter into conflict, or to defend. That amygdala doesn't switch off at all. And so we are perennially stressed. And this is true especially in our world where we have stress from multiple angles. It's not just stress that is coming from having to comply, finish your deadline. There's stress personally, there's stress in our relationships, stress from social media because of this constant need for visibility and for validation. Everything is contributing to stress. Our media, the news that comes to us from the media, everything is a source of stress. The behavior of others, which means that we are always in a state of agitation, keyed up. And this is causing a lot of psychological disorders in people, not just here, across the world. There was a time when we were concerned that, diabetes is the most threatening lifestyle condition. Increasingly, we are finding that psychological disorders are very much on the rise. And even in the KYM, our maximum care seekers come to us for musculoskeletal issues. But in the last 5-6 years, we see a trend where the number of people coming to us with psychological issues is increasing because of extreme amounts of stress. Now, chanting is a very good way because chanting helps to lengthen exhalation. When you work on lengthening the exhalation, it will support the inhale function. Naturally, when the length of your breathing becomes better, when your ability to pay attention, to meditate becomes better, it triggers the vagus nerve activity. So the parasympathetic response, which is the rest and digest response, very necessary for the body to heal, very essential for immune function to be boosted, because our lack of resilience is attributed to the pressure of stress. And so when the vagus nerve response is stimulated, naturally the stress comes down. When stress comes down, immunity becomes much better. And so this is again another very important area where sound is a very useful contributor. Now, coming to certain essential guidelines that see, many schools in yoga schools, especially across the world, mandate the use of chant. That they just start with certain mantras, whether or not the students are inclined, whether or not they are willing to comply with this. It is mandatory. I'm not saying this is wrong. This is an inherent part of the Sanatana Dharma tradition where we chant at the beginning for many reasons. And sir would say that there are 2 reasons why you chant at the beginning of a class. One is to bring attention, because we are all over the place. As teachers, one might come from a different class into this class. And so to disconnect from the previous activity and connect to what is now unfolding, chanting becomes a bridge. Also, it is a way of honoring the parampara, to create an attitude of humility that I am not here, I'm not a big teacher or anything. I am here representing a parampara, a huge unbroken legacy of teaching. And so the use of mantra at the beginning is a way of connecting to that Guru Parampara, of seeking their blessings, and to say, without saying it, to actually say that I am nothing, I am an instrument that is passing on this legacy. But sir was very sensitive. When I say sir, I speak of Desikachar, that you could not impose chanting on someone who was unwilling. And so it is very important that chants are selected by a teacher who is competently trained both in yoga as well as in chanting, because you need to know chanting, you need to know chant pedagogy, you need to know about notations, you need to know about how to teach a student to chant, and you need to have some idea of the meaning of that chant. What is the bhavana inherent in the chant? After this, one considers the interest, the capacity, and the readiness of the student. See, someone might come to me and say, I want to learn the Rudra Prashna. Can I just teach? I need to ensure that there is a certain capacity, the ability to chant. Pronunciation of the words is important. Intonation of the words is important. And if this process of learning a chant is only going to create more stress, then that might not be an advisable tool. Instead, I could use my yukti, my intelligence, and say that yes, we will come to this eventually, but maybe we pull out one portion of the Rudram. Say Namo Bhavaya, or Bhavaya Namaha, Shivaya Namaha, Shivataraya Namaha. Pull out little phrases and then introduce these little by little, and then you can build the practice. So there are many ways of applying chanting. Always, as a rule, better to use chants that the student is familiar with. In fact, when we use chanting in our courses, we always ask the student, is there a chant that you are commonly doing? Is there an Ishta Devata that you connect to very easily? If you tell us, we will create the practice around that chant. So it's never the teacher deciding. And very, very importantly, we are not restricted only to the use of Vedic chants, the smritis, or chants only in Indian languages. This is an important contribution of Krishnamacharya's tradition, of Desikacharya's approach, that sound helps. Sound is very potent. What you choose to use can be from the student's tradition, any language of the student's choice, because that familiarity, the moment there is a familiar word, in that familiarity itself, there is a comfort, because there's no stress about doing something new or unknown. I experienced this. I was teaching in the USA to a very strong, to a group where there were a large number of, very, very Catholic-minded individuals, very conforming to their Catholicity, to their beliefs. And when we started working with some sound, initially could see that there was a lot of resistance, a lot of tension, even that doing something that was not comfortable. And so repeatedly, I would take the time to explain every word, and I'd say, this is what we are trying to say. This is what this word means. I am not using anything that connotes a specific deity or a form, because the chants I were using were only mantras to do with health, healing, peace. And so I pulled out every word and I said, this is what it means. Chant, see how you feel. And by the end of that week, this was the same group that was demanding to be taught more chants. So there is a necessity to be moving at the pace set by the student. And the student has to ensure that there is comfort. Otherwise, the very tool itself can turn against us. And so at no point do we compromise the student's comfort level, because I might have my own personal affiliations. My Ishta Devata might be a Ganesha or a Shiva or a Vishnu, doesn't matter. That is for my personal sadhana. That is my Antaranga sadhana. And this is what Krishnamacharya did. He didn't impose. He said, you find your Ishvara. Where do you find it? You find it in your tradition, in something that is familiar to you. That's very important. And we see that our Kesika records, I said, that pretty much all our course plans, course designs use some form of chanting. May not be entire mantra sequences, but use of sound is there. And when we see the feedback that we generate among these care seekers, 80% of care seekers, this is the minimum, reporting 60%, a minimum of 60% symptom relief by the time of their 4th class. So this is within about 1 month from their first class, by the time they come to class 4. Which is significant feedback. And it's very heartening to see how sound can be used. And so in conclusion, there is a lot of evidence that sound, specific sound in yoga practice is a very effective tool. Whether it is merely yoga therapy to work with healing, or from a much larger perspective, from a spiritual perspective, from an environmental, from a social perspective, the use of sound, how it impacts others in our vicinity. And naturally, this is an area where far more studies need to be done. But we say that you leave aside everything, the technicalities of bringing sound into yoga, because as I said, you need a base in yoga and you need a base in chanting, and you need to know design course plans. You need to observe the student. You need to, these are the teaching methodology skills and the skills of consultation that we have. But what is it doing at a fundamental level? What is the use of sound doing? It helps us to give voice to the voiceless, to speak what is not spoken, speaking the unspeakable. There's so much that we suppress, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or unconsciously, because often in many cases of trauma, many situations that we find ourselves in, either society or the rules of politeness prevent us from saying certain things, or the relationship between certain people. You might feel it, but you can't say it. And so in so many levels, without realizing it, there is a suppression of our emotions. Now, what does this do? It builds up. And when it builds up, it can set in to become quite rotten. It can hurt us inside. This is how trauma develops. because we have no way of letting go of those emotions. And chanting, we have seen in many cases, gives you an outlet, because you are giving voice to what has been suppressed. And for many people, we find that they are very resistant to chanting. I've seen this in many students. First practice, they say, no, I don't want to chant. I'm very resistant. I'm not comfortable hearing my voice. And we say, it's okay, just go with the breathing, do what you can. And then little by little, we say, try the chant in one posture, or just as you're sitting and breathing, little by little. And we see slowly their progression from, not being able to say anything, keeping their lips tightly shut. They start doing soft pronunciations, they can hear. And then little by little, that becomes louder. And then after a point, they say, I feel so good. And something transformational has happened. And I think this is what our teacher Desikachar summed up so beautifully. In just one line in his book, What Are We Seeking? He says, we are seeking center, we are seeking stillness. And in this process, there's so much of impurity, so much of toxicity that we have accumulated. We have no way of letting it go. It's here in our heart space. Dukkha, it's clouding, it's polluting our heart space. Chanting opens our hearts. What does it open us to? It opens us to an entire universe of possibilities. And this is such a beautiful idea, that the use of sound itself can be such a life-affirming practice, that it can open you out to a myriad experiences. So with that said, I conclude this presentation, where I've just tried to give you an overview of the various possibilities that sound, the use of sound and its application in yoga gives. As I said, we have only touched the tip of the iceberg. In practice, there's so much that has to be learnt, experienced, and then taught. So with this, again, I thank Mauli, I thank Damaru for this invitation, and I wish Bilba and all these other endeavors to bring forth the immense legacy of the Sanatana Dharma of our Guru Paramparas to keep this alive. My heartfelt Okay, Mauli, over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. I totally understand what you said was the tip of an iceberg, but so many facets of sound you just unfolded in front of us today. And at last, praise chanting opens our hearts. So beautifully said. So, ma'am, would you be okay if we take a couple of questions before we end the talk?
Absolutely.
Okay. So we have received some questions. I will simply narrate them to you. Somebody is asking us, what exactly does the word parampara mean? If we are to adhere to the age-old principles, they might not be relevant to current times. So how is it important to uphold it?
See, you could say parampara is the term used to refer to teaching that has stood the test of time for at least 100 years continuously without a break. There should be a sufficient number of people following it for a practice or a knowledge system to become parampara, usually held and transmitted from teacher to the next generation of students. Those students go through a process. See, the Vedanta tells us Shravanam, Mananam, Nididhyasam. You have to first listen, and then you take it in, you integrate it, you constantly mull over this. That Mananam is that ongoing process of reflection. Nididhyasam, you have to meditate on this until you claim that teaching as your own. Until then, you've received it. It was your teacher's teachings. It has to become yours. Then you are ready to pass it on. And this is how a parampara forms. It's not merely in the acquiring of a paper degree. You have a bit of paper that says, okay, you are a yoga teacher. You're a yoga teacher. No doubt you've gone through, you have the skills, but there's something beyond. And that is born of experience. It is born of sadhana. And I would say sadhana is the core, is the fundamental of parampara. And when it comes to relevance, it's a question of what lens are we using to look at these traditions. So often the problem for us, I feel, is that we are attempting to judge a parampara or a tradition that was created 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 2000 years ago, 8000 years ago, through a 21st century lens, through a very, very different lens. When you're using the wrong instrument to look at the Shastra. And if you go back to the Darshanas, for instance, it was a very beautiful, you see the dialogue that is so beautiful. They agree to disagree. So many darshanas. You have Charvaka on the one hand, you have yoga on the other, you have Vedanta. Charvaka says, rinam kritva gritam pibet. It's okay, enjoy, drink ghee. You can incur a debt, it's okay, you live only once. This is one end. Vedanta says the only purpose of your life is Brahman, and that every other experience is mithya. It's not of two different viewpoints, but they agreed to disagree. They met at a table and said, this is my viewpoint, this is your viewpoint, this I will take, this I will reject. That spirit of accepting everything, unfortunately, is lost. And we are putting a very, very modern perspective on this, and then you judge and say, oh, this is superstitious, this is religious, this is useless. Say, for instance, the Sanatana Dharma tradition, you take something like the Grahana, the Surya Grahana eclipse. And there are various niyamas. You do this, you don't do this, you eat at a certain time, you don't see the eclipse with your bare eyes. You can dismiss this as, all of this is just old wife stories. My grandmother said this, there's no reason. See, a problem is, unfortunately, the people who transmitted this information didn't tell us why. Why? Because it was implicit. They said that the Shastras tell us you do it. But our mindsets have changed now. But now we are going back and saying that there is some validity. There are tests that have been done where you see actually how food changes in the Grahana period. What are the chemical changes that are happening to food? As an example, I came across a study which is now trying to validate this ancient belief. So in so many ways, another thing that has happened, I would say that's unfortunate, is that any tradition starts off with a certain value. The value of the Sanatana Dharma tradition lies in its reverence for everything. Everything is Brahman. Therefore, everything, whether it's sentient or insentient, is worthy of reverence, worthy of respect, worthy of love. Unfortunately, this is the value system, and this evolves into a set of practices demonstrated by certain people, personalities. It concretizes, as you could say, a symbol. But we are left only with the symbol. The symbolism is lost to us. We don't know, and we don't make the attempt because the symbol is very deeply hidden. See, for example, I'll give you another example. In India, you see the symbol of breaking a coconut. And your modern educated mindset says, oh, what rubbish this is. What a waste of money. What a waste of a good coconut. But what is the Sanatana Dharma? Okay, leave alone Sanatana Dharma. This comes in with a certain, it is a symbol. It is a practice that is done. The breaking of the coconut signifies the breaking of the ego. The coconut has a hard outer shell. If you have to move somewhere spiritually, the first thing that has to go is the ego. So at the beginning of any activity, you break a coconut. Now, along with this, you have all other stories that are building up. You don't do this, Ganesha will be upset with you. It's not about Ganesha being upset. It is about me reminding myself that I need to break my ego before I set forward. But because there's this gap between symbol and symbolism, and we are not making the effort, we don't have the time to bother to go in. We don't have the time to ask, why is this being done? And therefore, we dismiss so many things. So I would say the need of the hour is to revisit the sources, go back to the roots. And there will be sense in it that these people didn't say what they were saying just like that. If you have a tradition that has survived 4,000 years, 8,000 years, it survived invasions, it survived all kinds of attacks on it. There has to be something of value, right? Can I accept that and then start exploring instead of dismissing outright and say, oh, this doesn't make sense? Because through logic, there are many things one cannot explain. How do you explain the logic of mantra, for instance, that you chant mantra and it creates a certain ambience of protection? Maybe they will come up with an instrument to measure it. You can only feel it. And these experiences and feelings are beyond the realm of logic.
Very, very true. Okay, moving to the next question. Okay, so Vedic chanting and normal chanting, how are they different in terms of their power, efficacy, and benefits? Like one could chant a mantra like Ram or say Om Dum Durgaya Namaha, or one could just choose to write Likhita Japa instead of chanting. So, how is that different from the Vedic chanting per se?
See, the only difference I would say between Vedic chanting and other chanting is in the notation. The Vedic chanting is very clear. The swaras are very clearly defined. Who defined them? This is the tradition. Whereas when it comes to other mantras, other chants, there's no defining rule as far as swara is concerned. You can chant the Bhagavad Gita in any way. You can't chant the Gayatri mantra in any way. And you certainly can't set the Gayatri mantra to a rock and roll rhythm. It's not possible. It's not permitted. People do it, it's different, but it is not sanctioned. Whereas a later Smriti can be recited, can be written, all of that is fine. So I would say, other than this, there is no difference in the potency. Remember that with any sound, what precedes the sound is thought. And so, where the thought is powerful, where the thought is potent, that is what is coming through as the articulated sound. Whether it is a mantra or whether it is some other sound, that is immaterial. That is what Sir said. See, the mantras in themselves are very potent because they are born of the meditative experiences of these rishis. See, it's like this, I want to experience some higher state, for which, from where I am, I need to struggle, I need to do a lot of work. But instead, there are these great masters. You have the rishis, you have the seers. They have done all the work and they just give it to you like that in your hand. Think of how much easier it is to hold on to that and continue. So, naturally, the Vedic mantras are in a class by themselves. It doesn't mean that other sounds are not powerful, because sound is a manifestation of intention. And so, you could very well say, you could use something in English, I pray that I, myself and my family and everyone around me is very well and healthy. This could be the mantra that you repeat, but there is an intention there. That's all that matters.
Yeah, so we also see a lot of, like you said, the Gayatri Mantra has to be chanted as the notation, as per the notations. But we see not just from the, I can say, the Western perspective, but also today, the newer generation, they want to sing the Gayatri Mantra as per what they want, as per what they feel. So intention is still there, but the notations are lost in that process.
See, unfortunately, that certain things we have to hold the sanctity, that we are not permitted to touch. I would say leave it aside. There are other things if you want to set to your own tune. Why do you want to come to the Vedic mantras? There are other things. Can we leave them aside? They've been given that way for a purpose. Who are we in our limited intelligence to attempt to change? This is a question that I have.
I totally agree to that. Okay, the next question, somebody is saying, is the study of Sanskrit language essential to do the Vedic chanting?
See,
I think that
in the
you
way,
already answered, but yeah.
in this tradition, in the KYM approach, not really. You don't need to even know to read the Sanskrit. You don't need the script, because we use, see, it is an oral Shastra. Fundamentally, this is transmitted orally. Shabda Pramanam, it is from the mouth of the teacher to the ear of the listener. This is how they chanted. You didn't even have sheets of paper. Now, because our attention span is so minuscule, we are forced to use papers. In those days, children had no papers. You had to learn by heart. But even so, you have English transliterations that are very comfortable. And some people, when you come from different languages, especially when you see Tamil and Sanskrit, sometimes there are conflicts in terms of how certain letters are pronounced. We can surmount all of that. I wouldn't say it's essential, but a knowledge of Sanskrit makes the whole process that much more magical. The experience when you know what you're chanting, the meaning is different from doing it, just like a parrot, you don't know what you're saying. Surely there is a difference. But I won't say that it is mandatory, at least to begin to have this experience. It doesn't matter. We have people from all languages who speak no Sanskrit or who have no exposure to Indian languages, learning and chanting so beautifully. So I would say at some level, the power of the sound transcends language.
I agree to that. I remember when I was at KYM for my chanting, in my group, there were a couple of people who were from Italy and they were chanting so beautifully.
Yes.
And we still connect to this day. Okay, so moving on to the next question, it
Uh-huh.
seems to have come from a yoga teacher. Uh, there are many different styles of yoga. KYM follows a vinyasa krama way. Can you throw more light on that method of practice and its benefits over other forms or schools of yoga?
I don't think Desikachar at any point of time envisioned his approach as a style. He was very hesitant about being branded as a certain form. See, what is a vinyasa? Vinyasa is a sequence, an intelligent sequencing of asanas. Any posture is a vinyasa. If I told you now, do a Shirsasana, would you just like that, can you stand on your head? There is a krama. You have to move the Shirsasana Vinyasa is you kneel down and then you position your fingers and then you move your head down. The crown has to rest on your fingers. You raise your lower body up. You walk towards your hands and then you kick up. All of this is a krama. There is a series of steps. You go into the Shirsasana, you come out, you come back to your starting position. This is a Vinyasa. This is, I would say, not a style. It is a sensible, practical approach to teaching yoga. Everything you do is a vinyasa. This is applicable even to our life. If you had to cook, I mean, you come up with you want to make a dokla. The dokla doesn't just happen like that, right? You have to get your ingredients, prepare them. So there is a purvanga phase where you prepare and you reach your goal. You've kept the doklas ready to steam and they are ready, they are cooking. And then you descend, you just take it out, you serve it ready to eat. This is what you call a vinyasa, a certain approach of moving into a posture, staying focused, achieving your goal, moving out of the posture. It can apply to a posture, it can apply to a series of postures, it can apply to practices of asana, pranayama, dhyana. And you also have vinyasas that happen over time. Class 1, I do this. Class 2, I do this. Class 3, I do this. So, this kind of a progression over time is what we call vinyasa. I wouldn't want to limit it and say that this is a style.
Okay, I am glad you're remembering those doklas. Okay, with that, I think we are done with the questions. So, we generally may want to write a formal thank you note to acknowledge or show our gratitude to the speaker. But with Nrityaji, this gratitude goes beyond such formalities. And
Absolutely.
thank you suddenly just feels like a distant words. What naturally emerges is love and prayers for this beautiful soul, not just for the finesse, expertise, and command on her subject matter, but for the immense contribution that she is doing to the preservation and revival of our cultural traditions. She's young, pursues excellence, and is totally unstoppable. Team Damru is grateful to you, Nrityaji, for always being with us and helping us contribute in our little ways to build this repertoire of knowledge and traditions of Sanatana Dharma. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mauli. And you can be rest assured you always have my support for anything that Damaru needs to do. I'm at your back.
That's a
So thank you
privilege.
and good luck.
Thank you, ma'am.
Because I'm only, as I said at the very beginning, I'm fortunate to be representing a tradition and very grateful to my teachers. If it wasn't for Sir, I wouldn't be here doing this. And my duty, therefore, as a student is to share with as many people as possible the immense value that he has given to us, that these teachings should not be forgotten and must reach as many as possible, because the you could say that the hallmark of the KYM approach is accessibility, that yoga is not exclusive. It is not for people who have a good physique, or people who can only, who are very flexible, who are strong. Our if you can breathe, if you are alive, you are eligible for yoga. Krishnamacharya was the same, that chanting was a field that was very, very closed, exclusive in its teaching. He opened the doors to everyone. He comes from a very orthodox background, no doubt, but he had the vision to say that anyone who has a genuine interest in learning and preserving these ancient traditions must be encouraged. And he called it apatkala dharma. He says this is a dharma that is in danger of disappearing. Anyone who is invested in protecting it must be supported. This was the argument that he gave way back at a time when I'm sure he met with a lot of opposition. And so, given that these are the teachers who didn't hold back their knowledge, I think the least we can do is to take this forward. So, thank you for this.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think even for me, the biggest takeaway when I had learned from various schools, but when I came to KYM, that's what I learned the most. That you have this certain mindset about yoga, doing yoga, teaching yoga, but it is accessible to everyone, and that simple but so powerful a thought was ingrained after coming to KYM. So yeah, always indebted to that. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much, Mauli.